Hello, and thank you to everybody who's watching, and to Kasia in particular and all her team for, as usual, this wonderful opportunity to share something and to be involved with our wonderful project. So today I'm going to be talking to you about, in keeping with our theme of nature, Pan in children's fiction and culture. So I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you will be able to see the PowerPoint as well. Make it full screen. And there you go. Okay, so Pan. The god Pan is a liminal figure. He's half man, he's half animal, and as such, like the centaur, he represents a monstrous side of humanity. He straddles the border between two worlds, whereas the centaur's lower half is the noble equine. Pan's bestial elements, like those of the satyrs, come from the goat, an animal associated with voracious sexuality, excessive libido, ugliness, and greed. This is reflected in the myths connected with Pan, many of which feature actual or attempted rape. Even in his less suggestive aspects, with his connections with nature, he's a strange and barely human creature, inspiring irrational fear, panic in those whom he encounters. Thus, he is one of the most difficult of gods to represent in a palatable manner for children. So in antiquity, Pan was known as the deity of the shepherds, who led the flocks from summer to winter pastures, a protector and guardian of their health. A creature of laughter and benevolence, he was often depicted playing his joyful music on his panpipes and dancing with the nymphs or satyrs. He wasn't only associated with music, but also with the sounds of nature, the echoing hillsides, the cry of the wind, the call of the beasts. A creature filled with sexual vitality, he was also a god of fecundity, enabling fertility of both vegetation and animals. But he also had a darker side, like nature itself, a hunter and inducer of panic in humans and beasts alike, capable of turning gentle souls into wild, flesh-eating creatures. Physically, Pan's appearance altered from the earliest extant depictions from the 6th and 5th century BCE, which show him simply as a goat, walking on its hind legs, sometimes with a prominent phallus, and playing his pipes, and that transforms over time to a more humanized portrayal. From the 4th century BCE onwards, he is shown as either a shaggy, bearded goat man with large horns, a tail, and cloven hooves, or as a young and handsome deity whose only signs of, I'll just move this so you can see Pan rather than me, his only signs of bestiality are two small horns, pointed ears, and an unobtrusive tail. The change in appearance paralleled the development in his character as he evolved over time from the wild goat god of nature to a more civilized urban deity. By the Hellenistic period, the caprine elements of Pan have been reduced to two tiny horns, hardly glimpsed with the soft curls falling gracefully across his forehead. He's an adolescent. In place of the earlier wildness, he's now a kindly, rustic deity, lord of a magical landscape in which the mountains and forests resonate with the singing of nimble-footed nymphs and the music of Pan's pipes. A variation of Pan in classical myth is the horned Roman deity Faunus, an ancient Italian god of the woods and countryside. Faunus was typically represented as a half man, half goat, and was accompanied by similar creatures known as fauns. Although the two deities were considered separate by many, Virgil, for example, makes mention of both Faunus and Pan independently. With the increasing influence of Greek mythology on Roman mythology in the 3rd century and 2nd centuries BCE, Faunus was naturally equated with Pan. And depictions of Faunus began to portray him with horns, although originally he didn't have such an element. Like Pan, Faunus was associated with merriment, and the twice-yearly festivals were marked by wild revelry. In particular, at the Lupercalia, a fertility festival held in his honor, youths clothed as goats ran through the streets wielding strips of goat skin. Similarly, the goddess Fauna, who was described as Faunus's daughter, wife, or sister, was associated with the goddess Bonadea, who also embodies many Pan-like attributes. So moving on to quite a big jump in history, the Edwardian period. We have the Edwardian cult of Pan. And as Eleanor Toland states in the abstract of her thesis on the Edwardian cult of Pan, a surprisingly high number of the novels, short stories, and plays produced in Britain during the Edwardian era, defined in terms of this thesis as the period between 1900 and the beginning of World War I, used the Grecian deity Pan, god of shepherds, as a literary motif. The technological developments of the age, which led to it being dubbed by historians the Second Industrial Revolution, caused a move from rural community lifestyles to that of urban loneliness and poverty. As a result of the dirt, deprivations and disease of industrialized city life, rural life was romanticized, again promoting the role of Pan as god of the natural world, and indeed the whole of nature itself. At the same time, with the rise of science and the advancement of ideas such as Darwin's theory of evolution, the predominant role of the Bible, both as sole moral authority and artistic stimulation, was challenged. The intellectual Edwardian elite sought new inspirations for both spirituality and art, turning to such varying sources as ancient British Druidic traditions, spiritualism and the occult, and the classical pagan world. And this last led to the rise of the Romantic neo-pagan movement, in which Pan played a prominent role, a prominence that was intensified thanks to the added influence of the Celtic nature god Cronus, who, like Pan, was depicted with horns or antlers. And these elements come together in the new genre of children's literature. Just as Arcadia was conceived of as a golden age, a mythical childhood of the race, so youth became identified with this perfect and ideal time. In order to achieve the new Arcadia, couched in terms of a utopia or New Jerusalem, people would have to return to the state of innocence and purity, becoming like little children. It was in part this interest in and emphasis on childhood that spurred on the rise of juvenile fiction. As the god of Arcadia, Pan's character within this literature exhibited certain very definite characteristics that fitted the deity to the philosophy. There we see again the idealized Pan. So in Edwardian's children's literature, I'm going to concentrate just on two things here, The Wind in the Willows and Peter Pan. I'm not going to deal with The Secret Garden. That's been ably dealt with by an article by Gillian Berzofsky in Helen Lovett and Owen Hodgson's very nice book on reception of classics and children's literature. But I'm going to be looking at The Wind in the Willows and Peter Pan in particular. So Pan appears in a powerful chapter of The Wind in the Willows, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, in which Mole and Rat go searching for Otter's son, young Portly, who's gone missing. Rowing down the river overnight, the pair find the missing youngster on an island, where he's briefly found a heavenly father, the protective Pan. Pan's presence is at first indicated by music, audible at first only to Rat, but compulsive, unearthly, alluring. I'm not going to read the whole quote. You can, at your leisure, pause the video and read it to yourself. But you can see the elements that are mentioned here, the specialness, the godliness that we have here, the feeling of transportation. The effect on Rat is, in fact, striking. We've got a few quotes here. Rapt, transported, trembling, he was possessed in all his senses by this new divine thing that caught up his helpless soul and swung and dandled it, a powerless but happy infant in a strong sustaining grasp. Soon Mole is also able to hear it, and he's breathless and transfixed as the liquid run of that glad piping broke on him like a wave, caught him up and possessed him utterly. He's got tears on his cheeks. He's powerfully affected by the clear, imperious summons that marched hand in hand with the intoxicating melody, impelling him to row towards the island. The music is an indication of divine presence is reflected by the suspension of the natural course of events. We're told that no birds sang as they want to do at the approach of dawn, and that apart from the music, all was marvelously still. Nature itself, or their awareness of it, is intensified. The rich meadow grass seemed that morning of a freshness and a greenness unsurpassable. Never had they noticed the roses so vivid, the willow herb so riotous, the meadow sweet so odorous and pervading. And arriving at the island, they experience a theophany. Here in this holy place, here if anywhere, we shall find him, with a capital H, declared Rat, while Mole feels a great awe, with a capital A, fall upon him as a result of the proximity of the deity. Such emotion turned his muscles to water, bowed his head, and rooted his feet to the ground. The god's appearance is described in detail, and it's clear that the god in question is the therianthropic divinity of the ancient world, complete with horns, hooves, and hairy skin. We have here the description of what Mole actually saw that makes that very clear. Again, I'm not going to read it and waste your valuable time. This Pan has altered radically, though, from the lusty, raw deity of the ancient world. Most prominently, he's been denuded of any sexual elements. As John David Moore puts it, as the genius of Graham's suburban sexless garden, Pan appears as a castrated Priapus. He's the god of nature, certainly, but not nature red in tooth and claw. He's the Pan of fin de siècle aesthetic paganism. In fact, Despite the fact that Pan is the god who is present, we've gone on to Peter Pan, we're not quite there yet. William specifically states that it was no panic terror. He's denying the uncivilized wild side of Pan, as he stresses that Mole feels wonderfully at peace and happy. In fact, the language is decidedly Christian in its depiction. Pan's described as the friend and the helper, and he's specifically the protector of the young, just as Jesus' willingness to permit little children to come onto him is also stressed. The revelation itself is accompanied by total silence and increasing light, and for Mole and Rat, the theophany, like acceptance of the Christian Messiah, brings enlightenment, joy, and peace. So here we come on to the screen that's already in front of you, the most famous usage, I would say, of Pan from this period, and that's J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, a figure who was hugely popular from the first publication onwards. This version of Pan is based not on the original Caprine god, but on the idealized pastoral deity of Hellenistic and Roman times, recast here in the young and attractive guise developed by the Edwardians. In this later development in book, stage, and film, Peter Pan retains some elements of the divine goat god origins. It can be seen in the illustrations that depict him and the costumes worn by those playing the role. Leaves feature prominently, either as the material of or decoration on his tunic, which is, especially after Disney's iconic portrayal, often green, reflecting nature. He often wears a hat with a feather, a relic of the avian aspect of his roots. More on that in a couple of minutes. His ears are frequently depicted as pointed, partly as a result of the influence of ideas like fairy folk, such as elves and sprites on Edwardian thought in general, and Barrie in particular, but also a legacy of Pan himself. In many versions, he still plays and carries the panpipes. On at least one occasion, the goat connection is there. For in early versions of the tale, he has a toy goat on which he rides. And in the screenplay written by J.M. Barrie for a silent movie that was actually never produced, we hear that Peter rides a goat through the forest playing a pipe, flies through the trees and lands back on the goat. But Peter Pan isn't a hybrid of man and goat, but he is only partly human, and he's got specifically avian elements. In Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens from 1906, he explains that all babies were birds before they were born, and therefore they are naturally a little wild during the first few weeks and very itchy at the shoulders where their wings used to be. And Peter Pan escapes from his nursery window, forgetting that he's now a little boy in a nightgown, and flies away. He's already quite unaware that he's ever been human and thought he was a bird and behaves as a bird. He attempts to catch flies, drink from his beak from a pond, and go to sleep perched on a branch. And finally, the wise old bird, Solomon Caw, tells him the truth. But Pan's liminal aspect is still emphasized, as Solomon calls him poor little half and half, and tells him that he will be not exactly a human, nor exactly a bird, but betwixt and between. Peter's panpipes also stem from the human-bird hybridity in this version, for he makes them in this version from a need to sing like birds do. Peter's heart was so glad he felt he must sing all day long, just as the birds sing for joy. But being partly human, he needed an instrument, so he made a pipe of reeds, and he used to sit by the shore of the island for an evening, practicing the sough of the wind and the ripple of the water, and capturing handfuls of the shine of the moon, and he put them all in his pipe and played them so beautifully. We're a long way from Syrinx here, obviously. In the words of Friedman, Peter Pan straddles the divide between birds and humans, and the instrument is a human invention that allows him to express his bird-like joy. In addition to the human-avian hybridity, Peter, like Pan, encapsulates duality and contrast in other ways. Neverland is, in fact, even more than Arcadia, a representation of liminality. A fairy tale kingdom that exists at the edge of the world is a borderland between sleep and waking, life and death, fiction and reality. It's beyond the bounds of civilization. Despite this wildness, Peter himself longs for domesticity, as represented by Wendy, the child mother. Indeed, maternity is a concept for the motherless boy that he both craves and despises. He's simultaneously the destructive destroyer of family and household and a protective spirit of the lost boys. Beyond the physical, Peter Pan also retains the essence of Pan in his character. Duality and liminality is always there, as reflected in conflicting presentation of his personality, as on the one hand childlike, innocent and excited, and on the other threatening, boastful, vain and arrogant. On occasion violent and selfish, even carelessly cruel, he's at other times the epitome of self-sacrifice and courage, veering between wild unconstrained joy and extreme self-control. His moods are mercurial, mercurial of course being the Roman name for Hermes, from whom Pan received many of these qualities, swinging from one extreme to another. Both sexual predator and asexual, his relationship with Wendy vacillates between the two perspectives, both from one version of the story to another and within the individual works themselves. Just as Pan represents life and growth, yet never matures or changes himself, so Peter symbolizes creativity, particularly in connection with his music, and is a lord of fertile nature, but remains forever frozen in childhood. The boy who will never grow up is therefore both the eternal youth and child, and undying and ageless immortal, as complex in many ways as Pan himself. So let's move on to 20th century literature. And here I'm just going to really look at one particular work, one of the most famous representations of Pan in children's literature over the past decades, and that's C.S. Lewis's Faun, Mr. Tumnus. And it's well known that at the start of C.S. Lewis's Narnia stories, there's the image of the faun, half man, half goat, walking through the snowy wood, clutching parcels and an umbrella. And on his first appearance, this faun is described as on the screen here. You can see he's got the elements that we're used to, the short pointed beard, the curly hair, the horns, and he is half man and half goat. Again, I won't read it. Clearly, we have some kind of Pan figure here, even though he's called a faun. And we learned a little later that there's a depiction of him from the relatively recent film of Mr. Tumnus. And after, here we see, the goat legs, the horns, all those elements we talked about, and he is clearly half an animal and half a human. A little later, we learned that he had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest, midnight dances, nymphs, dryads, fauns, and all these things that we connect very much with Pan, including Silenus and Bacchus himself. He plays his iconic panpipes. Here we have a picture of it, and the music is reminiscent of Kenneth Grahame's description of Pan as well. But we also hear that he took his case from its dresser, he took out from its case on its dresser the flute, as if it were made of straw, and began to play. And the tune he played made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep all at the same time. Clearly the same kind of emotions that we had with Wind in the Willows. But again, he's taking it out of a case on its dresser. What we have here is that Pan, while he is the rural god, is also in this depiction the antithesis of Pan. He's urbane. He's got all these elements of civilization. The case lives, the Pan pipe lives in a case on the dresser. Mr. Tumnus is clothed as an English gentleman. He's got a muffler and an umbrella. He's laden down with parcels, all elements that are a very long way from the wild nature of Pan's usual environment. And the picture continues with the description of Mr. Tumnus's home, a cave just around the corner, but also a cave that has everything that you'd want to connect with domesticity. He makes Lucy a tea that consists of a nice brown egg, lightly boiled for each of them, and then sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then toast with honey, and a sugar-topped cake. Don't forget that we're in wartime rationing at the time, and this is very much a wish fulfillment for the reader as well. The very domesticity of the cave is really emphasized. Lucy thought she'd never been in a nicer place. It was a little dry, clean cave of reddish stone with carpet on the floor and two little chairs, one for me and one for a friend, Mr. Tumnus, a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above that a picture of an old faun with a grey beard. In one corner there was a door which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. But this picture of perfect domesticity is undercut immediately with the more detailed description of the bookshelf itself. Lucy looked at these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Silenus, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks and Gamekeepers, A Study in Popular Legend, or Is Man a Myth? As Harrison points out, Juliet Harrison, Tumnus is ithyphallic. His home is full of sexually explicit books. Maybe there's something to say here about C.S. Lewis himself. His name comes from the word for swell and bump, and Lewis consistently, in fact, tames and domesticates the wilder and more mature elements of classical myth. Here's the quote from you and the source as well. There is nowhere more obvious than in the figure of the Pan-derived fauns of Narnia. This is nowhere more obvious than in the figure of the fauns derived from Pan in the Narnia series. So let's see what's been happening in recent years. Pan in the 21st century. The earliest and longest juvenile work devoted to Pan in recent decades is that by Donna Jo Napoli, who's well known for her retellings of fairy tales. The Great God Pan from 2003 is an extended novel for young adults, which seeks to fill the gaps in the myths of both Pan and Iphigenia, weaving them both together in a story that explains the cry of the sailor Tumnus in Plutarch's Moralia that the great god Pan is dead, as the god's self-sacrifice in order to save Iphigenia, whom he loves, is told. In the course of the narration, Napoli also weaves in other myths, giving them her own personal touch. The story of the nymph Syrinx and the origins of the Syrinx instrument, the deaths of the healer Asclepius and of Orion, and the musical tournament between Pan and Apollo. At the outset of this young adult novel, Pan is content with life and himself, a simple god of nature who enjoys bodily pleasures, but is a shallow and flippant creature untouched by love. Through his meeting with Iphigenia, he begins to question, becomes a troubled soul as a result of his dual nature, half god and half goat, feeling that he belongs to neither group. He's on some level ashamed of his animal elements, disliking being confused with a setter, and embarrassed when Iphigenia asks him what he is. What, not who. She's taken me for a beast. She's an idiot after all. And then answering her, a freak, I say. He's even more hurt when she remarks, it's too bad you're a god. You'd have made the best pet. Clearly more aware of his bestial parts than his divine ones, despite his own denial of these aspects. Conflicted by his hybridity, Pan has low self-esteem, and it's through this journey of gradual self-discovery, in the process of which he invents his panpipes and his acknowledgement of his nature and acceptance of love, that he finds peace. The story is told in the first person and in the present tense, using, according to one review on Kirkus, heightened language that places readers in the other world of myth, the lush and varying landscapes, embodying Pan's own inner state and frequently pulsing with erotic tension. If that's not an advertisement, I don't know what is. Thus, although the deity physically conforms to his classical type, he's actually a very modern character in psychological terms. He's made painfully vulnerable by love and tormented by a sense of alienation and questions of identity, his place in the world, and how others view him. In a couple of recent novels for youth, Pan is presented in a rather more downgraded manner. In the first book of Alan Gibbon's The Legendary trilogy, entitled Shadow of the Minotaur, in which the myths are set the setting for a virtual reality game, which pulls in the player in an attempt to take over the world, Pan is the game guide. He's, however, little more than the sketchy outline of the Greek god, and in fact describes himself as a satyr. He's a hoofed figure with panpipes, but no real connection with nature. This Pan is an uncertain trickster character, a pawn who is the servant of dark forces who are in control of the game, more of a pup character than the one familiar from Greek myth. And although he does have magical abilities, his power is limited. Similarly, in Solari Gentile's Hero trilogy from 2018, Pan is the god of the herdsman, and he has his usual panpipes and can be found in the woodlands among the dryads and centaurs. And his appearance is conventional. Here's the description. He's large, naked, muscled chest, but below the waist his body is of a beast. Cloven hooves, curling black hair. His face is ageless yet ancient, and his chin ends in a narrow and pert beard. From his forehead he's got the usual two short horns. But he is a somewhat different creature from that found in classical antiquity. First of all, he's only a minor god. His power is limited in comparison with the Olympians. On being asked how he knows what's going to happen, he declares, I'm a god, Lycon, but then pauses and admits, I overheard Athene talking to Poseidon. He states on more than one occasion that he's not a powerful god, although he is constant and unlike the Olympians, and he doesn't want honors, sacrifices, and prayers. In the first book, he explained that this is because he's more secure than most gods. And unlike other deities, he's treated with no deference. And this is an aspect that's presented as shocking to the pious hero, that's the name, not the characteristic, in the third book of the series, The Blood of Wolves. We have Cadmus, who's busy laughing at him, and he goes, I tell you, I'm a god. Hero is absolutely appalled by this, and she kneels by his form. She feels that her head should be lower than his, but it's difficult because he was lying down. And she's very sorry. She says, my brothers mean no offense, my lord. When we find our new home, I'll gather the sweetest fruit and we'll plant a grove in your honor, wait for you to find us. And Pan says, I told you I require no sacrifice. But then he raises his head and points at the others. You boys could learn a thing about reverence from your sister. But this advice is disregarded by the herdsman. Lycon says, stop it, hero. Can't you see Pan's getting above himself? Soon we'll be wanting temples and priests. And he's treated very casually by both humans and the gods themselves. Pan himself states with the shrug, yeah, the Pantheon doesn't tell me anything. A more light-hearted approach to Pan is that taken by Lucy Coates. Her Beasts of Olympus from 2015, this is a series, is a rare case in which Pan is represented as a parent. His son, Pandemonius, who's known as Demon for short, is the protagonist of these books, and he's a well-meaning youth with great talent with and empathy for creatures of all kind. He's reminiscent of Newt Scamander from J.K. Rowling. And it's this association with the natural world that is a central connection to Pan in these gently humorous adventure books for young readers. In appearance, Pan doesn't sound attractive, with his rather horrific animalistic features emphasized. He's got thick, hairy, goatee legs, big curly horns, yellow eyes with black slitty pupils, no clothes to speak of, and a set of silver reed pipes. He's also a somewhat alarming figure of power, at whose appearance chickens scattered across the yard, gabbling and squawking in terror, and who could call up a pack of ravening bears that would rip you to bits in an instant. Consequently, Demon is in awe of this giant creature, kneeling in the dirt and bowing his head when his father first arrives, because he wasn't too sure what you did with a dad, but it was certainly what you did with a god. Even if he dared, he wouldn't know what to call his father anyway. Your godness, your holiness, your dadness. And we hear that he is it's justified, this apprehension, because Pan wants to take Demon to Olympus, and he's uses threats if necessary to achieve that. Pan stomped over her butts like a charging centaur. Pandemonius is coming to me, he said, and that's final. You don't want to offend the gods by refusing to let him go, do you? There was nothing much Demon's mum could say to that, really. Mortals who offended gods usually ended up little piles of scorched ash, or as trees or rocks. Despite these fearsome predictions, Pan isn't actually presented as harsh after this point, although he is powerful and unpredictable as the natural world itself, which he seems in some ways the personification. He is the ruler of forests and wild creatures. He has a voice like mossy bark on ancient trees. It was deep and velvety, with a hint of crumbly roughness at the edges. And he smells of pungent green things, goatee musk and old stale blood. He's also connected to the world of animals. His pipes can calm fearsome beasts and monsters and send them to sleep. And when touching them, Demon can understand the language of insects. Like the gods in Rick Riordan's works, to which these books owe much in style and humour, Pan is, however, depicted as rather distant and lacking comprehension of the human world. He's an absentee father who has little understanding or patience with his son. He's not intentionally cruel, as evidenced by his reaction on discovering Demon thinks he's to be sacrificed to the gods. He's absolutely amazed. Sacrifice to the gods? Is that what you're here for, my own son? Did you hear that, nymphs? The sacrifice? That's a good one. He laughs some more, and the nymphs and cherubs flicked into view again, looking relieved. Pan scratched at a curly horn and ran a hand through his wild hair. Bits of bark, twig, and dead leaves fell out in showers. Boys use his toenails. I told your dear mother, but I forgot I hadn't told you. Come on, boy, follow me, quick as you like. Think it's high time we took you to see the stables of the gods. In the end, he does show himself more loving towards his son. He sweeps him up into his arms for a hug and gives him his magical silver panpipes to use in case of need. Pan also figures in two books with a stronger emphasis on the visual element in recent years. The first is Lynn Curley's Mythological Creatures, a classical bestiary, tales of strange beings, fabulous creatures, fearsome beasts, and hideous monsters from ancient Greek mythology. We have a page here, it opens actually, dedicated with a page dedicated to Pan, in which his connection with nature is emphasized, and the story of Syrinx is retold, emphasizing here the connection with the panpipes that symbolize the god. And from this time onwards, according to this version, Pan always carried his reed pipes, playing gay tunes when he was happy, but making somber music when he was sad. This sadness, surely strange on the part of the god, is then explained. For even though he was a god, Pan was very lonely. Sometimes he was overcome with despair and simply sat in a dark cave howling like a wounded animal. His echoing cries were so blood-curdling that anyone who heard them was gripped by a terrible fear known as panic. Somewhat unusually, the illustration of the god shows him as a young, strong male, his naked torso completely hairless, and even his smooth caprine legs are a far cry from the shagginess more commonly seen. His hair is dark and sleek, shining neatly around his pointed ears, and his horns and tail appearing more like shiny locks of hair than truly bestial. This is a refined Pan, slightly oriental or Indian in appearance, his dark eyes seeming to be lined with eyeliner. He is playing an aulos, a double flute, and he has one foot raised, perhaps to dance. Depicted in a peaceful countryside night scene beside a river, next to which stands a smiling female Helma, reminiscent of a caryatid, he himself is severe and unsmiling, and the illustration echoes the loneliness of the figure emphasized by the text. Different again in style and approach is Stephen P. Kershaw and Victoria Topping's Mythologica, an encyclopedia of gods, monsters, and mortals from ancient Greek from 2019, which also includes a page on Pan. Kershaw's a classicist who specializes in myth, and this work is an encyclopedia designed to appeal to young readers and introduce them to major Greek myths in an entertaining manner. The entry on Pan describes him as a god of nature and of the countryside, god of shepherds, hunters, meadows, forests, mountain peaks, and rocky crests. We're given various options as his parentage, Hermes or Penelope or Dryops or Zeus, and Hybris are suggested, but without further explanation or narration. Pan's connection with Dionysus and Apollo are mentioned, and at the bottom of the page, his appearance with his animal elements are briefly described in a very abbreviated and sanitized versions of the myths of Syrinx and Echo as well. Most centrally stressed, though, is his connection with music, as he plays on the panpipes and dances, but not very well. You can see here the musical notes and instruments that really stand out on the page. The image depicting the god by Victoria Topping, accompanying the text, is a striking full-page depiction of the god in her own very distinctive style, and she describes her method as follows. I'll move myself again. My pieces are created through building up multiple textures and images and combining these to develop a distinct visual language using recurring motifs. I work using a fusion of technology and traditional techniques, often using photography, painting, gold leafing, cut-up collage, which is then digitally scanned and arranged on the computer before I work back into the original digital print. In this case, you can see that there is the god is inside a vivid pink and orange circle on a solid green page that reflects the nature aspect of the god. We've got the traditional elements of his representation with flowers, musical notes, long pointed ears and curved goat legs and horns. Pan himself is shown against a black background that's evocative of a black figure vase, as is the gold leaf motif parallel with his curling horns. Similarly, despite the classical myth tradition of Pan and Syrinx, he also again plays an aulos, a double flute, rather than more usual panpipes, adding to the ancient ambience of the portrayal. But despite these elements, this is a very modern depiction. The god has long, flowing brown locks, and the predominant colors of vivid pink and orange that are a far cry from ancient art. Finally, to bring an example from outside the field of literature, we have the Lego mini figure produced in 2016. Although this representation is named Faun, it's clearly a Pan figure. He has curled grey horns protruding from his head, goat-like ears and legs, curly brown hair on his head and chest. He also has a short brown flute in his hand, stressing the musical element. Although his instrument is not a true panpipe, in fact, invoking images of the satyr and the story of Marsyas, the connection with music is emphasized, and the biography accompanying the figure states that Faun plays this flute, makes up silly riddles and dances all day long. He also sings a little, but again, it's mentioned that he isn't very good at it. Apart from music, the other aspect that's stressed is his connection with nature. He is carefree, living in the forest, where he gets along with all of nature and wouldn't dream of living anywhere but his forest home. His determination to help all animals, from talking to birds and helping squirrels collect their food, is highlighted. And again, you can see that, and he finishes up with, sometimes he wonders whether everyone in the world is as content and carefree as he is. Do they know how much fun it is to whistle back to the birds, or help the squirrels gather acorns for the winter, or rest their tired hooves in a cool running stream full of frolicking fish on a hot summer's day? But then surely, probably everyone lives like that. It's interesting to note that unlike some other figures in the series, Pan is not depicted as monstrous, despite his animalistic elements. His skin is yellow, a color that's associated solely with human characters in the minifigures series. As Oliver Brooks points out, unlike other minifigures who oscillate between monstrosity and humanity, it's clear through the coloring and use of human features that Pan is human first and animal second. He's also youthful, with rich brown hair, short beard, and an illustration of curls representing chest hair on his pectoral muscles. As such, he's perhaps more closely related to Pan than, say, for example, Mr. Tumnus. What trends, then, can be seen in the recent receptions of Pan for children? As in the ancient world, in almost every case, he's a god closely associated with nature, particularly the woodlands. Physically, he's still always a hybrid of goat and man. But there's a wide range, even in the relatively small number of offerings or interpretations of this. In some cases, his bestiality is emphasized. Lucy Coates' Pan, for instance, has thick, hairy, goaty legs, while Sulari Gentile's god has below the waist not the body of a man, but a beast. Other receptions, such as Donna Napoli's and the Lego minifigure, stress the non-animalistic elements. The portrayals also veer between showing Pan as a youthful figure, as in the case of the Lego character, those of the two picture books and Napoli, and as older, as in Coates, and particularly Gentile, whose face is ageless yet ancient. It's notable, however, that despite the range of interpretations, one striking aspect of the god in the latest representations is his lack of power. Napoli struggles to retain his Olympian father's attention. He's mocked by the nymphs and is as much wild goat as divine being, especially at the start of the book. His status clearly far below that of the other gods. Gibbons's Pan is a mere puppet, servitude to the powers that control the games. Here, as in Jensen's work, the limited nature of the goat god's power is stressed. Lucy Coates's Pan seems a slight exception, since he's seen by his son as a terrifying figure due to his divinity, but is then shown to actually be far less fearsome than Demon had expected. In contrast to the powerful, ancient nature god revered by the Edwardians with their idealization of the rural landscape and all it symbolized, Pan's become a figure without potency, a somewhat grotesque, semi-bestial, laughable deity. Perhaps in the modern technological age, this was inevitable. What remains to be seen is whether in the coming years, with more awareness of ecological issues such as global warming, Pan, the god of rebirth, will undergo a renaissance and revitalization of his own. Perhaps again, all hail the great god Pan will be something that is said. Thank you very much.